Well, hello and welcome to the latest Climate Pioneers episode. I'm Heather Clancy. I'm the editor at large with Trellis, and I am joined today by Taylor Francis, the co-founder of Watershed. I'm really excited about this episode. A couple of things I want to mention before I start. This is kind of like a live interview. I'm writing a story about this, so you get to see how I work behind the scenes. So I do have a lot of questions, but I do encourage you as well to insert your own questions in the chat. I will get to them about half an hour from now. We are recording, so we will also be posting this later, and I'll be writing plenty of stories about it. So you're basically eavesdropping here on me and Taylor. So hi, Taylor.
Hey, Heather, it's great to see you.
It is great to see you. I know you're in London. I'm in New Jersey, so happy cross-Atlantic interview today.
Yeah, awesome. And I'm excited to be a part of the new Trellis. I'm so excited for the new chapter.
Yeah, you actually shared something with me before we started that I'd love for you to share with the audience.
Oh, I'm just so delighted about the new Trellis name because Trellis was on the list of names we contemplated when we were starting Watershed. Naming anything is the hardest thing you can do. Mm-hmm. And I mean, GreenBiz was an awesome organization. Trellis is going to be a great new chapter.
Okay, so setting the plug aside, thank you for that. I didn't know that about, one other thing I didn't know about you was that before you left Stripe to co-found Watershed, that one of your first sort of involvements with climate was that you actually kind of cold emailed Al Gore's office and got yourself into a climate reality training project. So at the age of what?
That was when I was 12 or 13.
Okay, and then
I'd seen the Inconvenient Truth movie. And I was riled up. I saw it with my mom some summer, and I walked out of the movie theater with too much time on my hand and a lot of pent-up anger, energy, motivation to try to do something. And he started this organization called the Climate Reality Project. They've now trained tens of thousands of people, but I was lucky to be one of the first couple hundred people as they were just piloting it. And then spent high school going around doing the Inconvenient Truth PowerPoint for kids at schools all around California. Yeah.
So Watershed, a great success story already in terms of climate tech startups. I think you're valued at $1.8 billion, at least as of like February, your latest funding round. And you have some great marquee customers. We're going to get into them in a moment. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, why did you feel it was so important to do this as a startup? Like you were at you left Stripe, which is an amazing company, to do this. So why did you have to do this as a startup?
Yeah, so I guess a little bit of the story is I'd been really motivated on climate. My two co-founders and I all met at Stripe. We all had kind of come to a passion around climate and environment through different journeys, worked together at Stripe, saw there how impactful technology could be when it's done right to kind of solve big problems, in that case around economic infrastructure and payments. My co-founder Christian helped to set up what has become the Stripe Climate Carbon Removal Frontier Initiative, although the team that came after him has really taken it to the scale that's so exciting. And we basically started Watershed because we wanted there to be Stripe quality software, world-class enterprise software for the sustainability space. At the time, it was sorely lacking, right? This was a space with spreadsheets and PDFs and consulting. And why start Watershed as its own standalone company? I think one of the things that I learned at Stripe that you see everywhere is that focused organizations can do really amazing things. And part of the power of new companies is that they are maniacal about doing one thing exceptionally well. And I think even today, Watershed is unique in being an organization where the 350 people who work at this company are thinking about only one thing every day, and that is how can we help companies quantify their carbon emissions, their sustainability impact, drive that down over time. And there's just real power in having that be the only thing you wake up thinking about every day.
So sticking with the getting to know you phase of this interview, what question do you ask every job candidate?
I love asking people in their most recent role, if they had been the leader of that organization, either the CEO or the president or the executive director, what they would have done differently And I think it's a good way to get at agency, ownership, kind of thinking outside your own job.
Okay, so you got these great people. What do you do to motivate them? What's your most successful motivation tactic?
I mean, I feel super lucky that the Watershed team it's by far the most exceptional team I've ever worked with, full stop. And it is super hardworking, super smart, super motivated people. So I think the team brings the motivation. I think the thing that probably motivates all of us is the real work on the front line with customers. And so the most important part of our all hands every Tuesday is customer stories. What's going well? What's going not well? What's the feedback we're getting on how we can be better? And it's exciting to see that start to translate into a whole bunch of companies that are not just measuring and reporting well, but like have stories of initiatives that they've launched that they couldn't have launched without Watershed. So that concreteness, I think, is what gets us all energized.
So who can you count on for a reality check? You know, you need feedback, and you know you can trust this person.
I mean, I'm lucky to have two amazing co-founders at Watershed, Christian and Abby.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reality checking amongst the three of us. My mom is also very good for a reality check on bringing you down a couple pegs.
Actually, I'm curious. This is not something I was thinking about asking before, but you are co-founders with Avi and Christian. You don't really have other titles. I'm curious. How do you divide the responsibilities of what you're worrying about?
Yeah. So Avi and Christian lead the work on our product and engineering teams. I spend a lot of time on business and operations and customers.
And this sort of thing.
And this sort of thing. And we all kind of work on everything. And I think one of the things that was a deliberate choice at Stripe, that's a deliberate choice we brought over to Watershed, is to be an organization that de-emphasizes titles and hierarchy and all that sort of thing, because you want the person who is closest to the core work, closest to the ground level, regardless of what their title is, to be the person who's got responsibility and decision making on something. And it's been a really effective cultural trait for us, as I think it was a big part of Stripe being a really effective organization as well.
Okay. Time for true confessions. What was your biggest mistake so far, and what did you learn from it?
That's a good question. I think that when we were early in Watershed, we started Watershed in late 2019. We sold our first customer in December 2019, kind of started deploying with customers right as COVID was starting in 2020. Throughout that 2020, 2021 phase was when the kind of corporate climate movement really got some extra legs. That was when the first BlackRock letter came out. And I think in retrospect, we were probably a bit slow to accelerate into that moment. It was actually something we're lucky to have great investors. We're lucky to have a great board. There was one quarter where we came back to the board and said, hey, we beat every goal. We crushed every target. And the board said, you are making a mistake because you are not accelerating fast enough into what is an epic opportunity. And so I think I think the meta lesson there is probably to have great advisors around you, because we got that reality check pretty fast.
Yeah. So that brings us into like understanding more about Watershed. So like tell me a little bit about how the mission. So your mission today.
Yes.
What's your mission statement?
Yes. Our mission is to accelerate the climate economy. So we are optimists that the emergence of the zero carbon economy is both going to solve the existential problem that is climate change and is going to create all sorts of opportunity, jobs, companies, better consumer experiences, and that this kind of climate economy is the big epic shift of our times. But it's not happening fast enough. And so Watershed's mission is a mission around accelerating the climate economy. We think we can do that by building software tools that help companies measure their climate and sustainability impact, make better decisions, access clean power and carbon removal and sustainable aviation fuel and all the levers of decarbonization so that they can decarbonize faster. And we've got a milestone in mind on this, because I think one thing about climate is that it's easy to tell yourself you're doing well without having it actually matter at all. And so we've set a milestone of by 2030, we want to be reducing 0.5 gigaton per year of CO2. And that is kind of the North Star that we're powering towards.
So where are you right now?
We are very early. We've got a long way to go. And I will tell you something that's kind of neat. The math around the math around our impact is around how many emissions do our customers manage, and then how quickly can we help those customers decarbonize. And on that first component, which is kind of the step one, we just crossed a gigaton of annual carbon emissions by customers who use Watershed.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is, if it were a country, would be the fourth largest economy. It's close to 2% of the world's emissions. Mm-hmm. That's not quite right, because downstream scope 3 sums up the emissions of product usage over 10 years. So it's not quite apples to apples, but still, There's a gigaton of carbon per year on the Watershed platform. And that's a lot of scale. That's a lot of leverage.
And if I'm remembering correctly, when you announced your funding in February, that was like at about half of that?
I don't remember exactly. That number has grown very quickly.
Okay.
And it has grown much faster than we expected. And it's I think, testament to large companies, whether it's in all sorts of categories. There's a lot of leverage in large companies. And, a lot of these companies have city size, state size, country size emissions. And that means there's some real potential impact.
So how are they using your software? So you have these meetings every week. People talk about their customers and the stories. So what stories are you hearing?
Yeah. So people use our software as kind of the system of record for sustainability at their company. You can think about kind of 3 big buckets of work that they're doing with Watershed. The first bucket is around measurement, right? And that is the beginning. You can't manage what you can't measure. And so companies come in, they upload their operational data, their finance data, their HR data on their products, bring it into Watershed and use our software to calculate a really granular, auditable, actionable carbon footprint. And that's true if you're in the physical economy and your General Mills or your Walmart, your Colgate. It's true for financial institutions like KKR and Carlyle. It's true for tech companies like Stripe, one of our first customers. So that's kind of step one. And that arms companies with this dashboard on sustainability data, just like they got dashboards for all the other data at the company. Step 2 is around reporting. And this is becoming a huge imperative, obviously, as this goes from voluntary to mandatory. That's CDP. We're spending a lot of time on CSRD. Our team here in Europe has built a really kind of outstanding platform around solving all the different data points of CSRD. And then the last piece, and the piece that gets us most energized, is companies actually doing something about their emissions. And there's so many stories on this. One I will share that it got me really motivated recently. Obviously, scope 3 is the black box problem. And Canva, a customer of ours, kind of Australian design software, growing like crazy. A lot of their emissions are from their print partners. So if you design something in Canva, get it printed, the paper is where the emissions are coming from. And they realized that most of their scope 3 emissions were their print partners' scope 2 emissions. And with Watershed, with the Watershed Marketplace, set up a virtual power purchase agreement across a whole bunch of print partners who are now buying clean power. It's reducing their scope 2 emissions. It's reducing Canva's scope 3 emissions. And there's solar in the Midwest that wouldn't be there without the whole Canva supply chain. So all sorts of stuff like that is then the piece around turning these numbers into real decarbonization, real action on getting to zero.
So where are your customers, though, primarily right now? Are they mainly in phase 1, like where they're just getting their arms around this? Because that's that was a great example. I think it's an unusual example. I don't know that
yes.
a lot of your customers are going that far yet. So what's the maturity level of how the customers are using and engaging with your services and software?
It's all across the board, candidly. So I think that supply chain PPA, to our knowledge, was kind of one of the first of its kind for a company at that scale, right? You see the Apples of the world doing clean power purchases across their supply chain. You don't see a lot of companies any smaller than that. So we were super proud of that. And I don't think it's that irregular. We've got, tons of customers that are buying clean power, funding carbon removal, purchasing sustainable aviation fuel, engaging their suppliers. I'm actually pretty heartened by the pace at which companies are able to kind of power through the measurement and reporting morass. At the same time, look, this is the year in which companies are figuring out CSRD. They're figuring out what mandatory reporting looks like. That is all a valuable baseline foundation of having numbers you can trust. And it's a lot of time that's not spent decarbonizing. I think a lot of people in this space feel a bit of frustration around being stuck in the paperwork mode. And I resonate with that. I think we got to move through paperwork and into action mode fast. Obviously, part of our goal is if we can make the paperwork a bit easier, we can help people spend the time on the stuff that really matters.
So do you have a customer council that helps with defining new features and services that you might offer? How do you interact with your customers to get things changing and moving forward?
Yeah. Yes, we've got a whole set of customer advisory boards in different sectors. But I think that even more important than that structure is just the culture of the company and how do the 350 people at Watershed kind of make decisions every day. We've got a set of operating principles. And the very first one since the first day has been customer obsession. Kind of work backwards from what does the customer need? What is the pain point they're trying to solve? And, the most important email that we get at the company every day is set out by our customer team every Monday on here's a digest of what happened with the customers last week. So I think even more important than the process is getting that type of just utterly customer obsessed culture embedded across every team.
So what are some of the other principles?
One operating principle that I care a lot about is this notion of trying to have a team that brings both intensity and care, building a team at the intersection of intensity and care. And the thought there is that there are a lot of companies, a lot of organizations that are intense, driven, competitive, but kind of heartless. And we don't want to be one of those companies. And there's also companies that are really caring and empathetic and kind, but maybe aren't as rigorous about their craft to do great work. And we want to be a company that's kind of at the intersection of intense, accountable, driven, really motivated to deliver great outcomes for customers, and caring, empathetic, kind of unusually high integrity, unusually thoughtful about where their coworkers are at in their life outside of work. And when you get that intersection right, there is, I think, something pretty magical that happens. It's not for everybody, right? It may be too intense. It may be too kumbaya for some people, but there's something magical about getting a group of people who are bringing both intensity and care to work every day.
Amen to that one. I love that. So back to your customers. How do they pay for your software? What's your model like for that?
We're an enterprise software business, and so companies pay an enterprise software license. It scales with how many of our modules they're using and the scale of the deployment. And that's the core of the business for us. We also have companies can get extra support. We've got a whole network of partners. We partner with a lot of the big four who are helping companies with a lot of the hands-on work. But yeah, the core for Watershed is a kind of enterprise software business to be this core software platform for sustainability data.
And that Canva example that you used before, how do you get paid for that?
So we have a kind of marketplace where we are enabling companies by kind of aggregating their purchasing power to get access to lower cost clean power, lower cost carbon removal, lower cost sustainable aviation fuel than they'd be able to get on their own. And there's a kind of marketplace fee as part of that. But that for us is not the core revenue driver. That is about helping the customers that are already Watershed customers be as successful as they possibly can on driving the next stage beyond just the numbers of actually driving decarbonization.
I'm going to pause here for a moment and just remind people that if you have questions, I'm going to start some in about 10 minutes. So put them in the chat and we will filter them and take a few of them. Taylor, one thing I was doing before we started chatting is looking through some of the market reports on this, because you're in a very crowded category.
Yeah.
I think there's like 80. Verdantix just did a report about 88 of them, like 88, like piano keys, right? How do you distinguish yourself?
Well, let me tell you I think that the core about this category is that this is a category where it's kind of easy to say something and hard to do and hard to deliver it. And so we differentiate by being the platform that kind of actually delivers on the outcomes that we hear customers trying to accomplish. And the core outcomes that are top of mind when I talk to customers are kind of rigor, the numbers that they can stand behind, numbers that they can trust, action and decarbonization, actually being able to implement the initiatives, measure the progress of initiatives that get them to zero, and then efficiency. Ultimately, companies want to minimize the amount of time, minimize the total cost that they invest in this program. And so we differentiate on being the platform that kind of delivers those outcomes in a measurable and quantifiable way, where kind of proven out in the stories of nearly 2% of the world's carbon emissions from customers that are using our platform. And where that comes from, I think, is just a lot of maniacal focus on bringing together technology, bring together science, bring together policy, and bringing those three things together in one platform and one team to deliver on those outcomes.
So who's in the room when you close a deal? At the customer, who is it that you're talking to? What teams?
It's a great question. We've seen a big shift in the last year. It generally is a kind of alliance between sustainability, finance teams getting a lot more involved, CFOs, controllers, who are caring about these numbers. They're putting in their 10Ks, they're putting in their annual reports, and trying to bring that same level of rigor to their sustainability numbers. And then increasingly supply chain and value chain teams who, if you're going to solve scope 3, you need those teams in the loop in order to actually engage suppliers, change practices. So it's been neat to see the kind of cross-functional alliance. And then the last component I would say is obviously the IT teams and technology organizations that view this as a core part of the tech stack in the same way that HR software or finance software, ERP software is a core part of the tech stack.
So you mentioned that that's changed a lot in the last year. Who should be in the room who's usually missing? Like the corporate sustainability professionals who are on this listening and eavesdropping, who do they need to get there at the first meeting that they usually don't have at the first meeting?
Yeah, I think that bringing finance and IT into the picture early is really important.
Okay.
And that it's just like this has become such a core part of the finance and compliance and governance operations of a company. And that's why controllers really want to be in the loop, right? You think about CSRD, it's one of the biggest expansions of what companies publicly report in decades. And then IT teams realize that these are results that are business critical, and business critical results need business critical systems. So we see a lot of success when those teams are around the table early.
Okay. There have been a boatload of articles published in just like the last month about how ESG is dying, sustainability is going away. It's just the fad is kind of going away.
Yeah.
How has this backlash affected your go-to-market strategy, or what effect is it having on your conversations?
Yeah, I hear that a lot as well. And here's my take. I think that the ratio of talk to action has kind of inverted. Go back 3 years, everyone had a climate pledge that they were rolling out every day of the week. And companies weren't doing all that much about it. Today, I think people are right. There's a little bit less rush to the press release than there used to be. But I see behind the scenes companies actually taking action with a lot more kind of force and concreteness than they used to. And so, I don't know. I would prefer the ratio to be the way it is now rather than the ratio it was 3 years ago. I think the reason companies are taking action, even if the kind of ROI on the press releases has changed, is that sustainability deployment is in the money, right? Companies make money by being on the cutting edge of the carbon economy, being on the cutting edge of the climate economy, saving money at the same time they reduce carbon. And the pressure from investors, the pressure from customers, the pressure from regulators is stronger than it's ever been. So I don't know. I know that narrative is out there. It doesn't really map to what I see companies actually doing in practice. I think that, yeah, I'm happier with a higher action to talk ratio.
So what list of questions should a ESG or sustainability professional use when they're evaluating a vendor like you? Like what should be on there? You got to check these things out.
Yeah. I think the questions that folks should ask are, well, first kind of decide what you're solving for, and be really thoughtful about not just trying to check the box on having a sustainability software, true or false. Like, this is not a binary. This is a question of, are you going to have infrastructure and foundation that is going to enable you to achieve great business outcomes for the company 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, 10 years from now? And those business outcomes are probably around rigor, compliance, risk, being on top of this new regulatory era of CSRD, public disclosure of sustainability data, doing that in an airtight way where you are not spending half the year in audits correcting numbers endlessly because you haven't kind of had it traceable and auditable the whole time. And then the other zone of outcomes is around delivering decarbonization and delivering the business impact that comes from being successful on those goals. So I think that's step one, is to define what you're trying to solve for, and then look for, what is the demonstrated results and unique approach on those. So for example, on rigor, we see that the vast majority of carbon footprints that are done kind of the traditional way have some sort of material misstatement. And sure enough, in audits, the vast majority of audits have some sort of quantitative findings where you're changing numbers because the auditors found something. And so at Watershed, we've built 150 different safeguards all across the journey of raw data to final report that prevent against 78 different types of errors. And 100% of our customers pass audit when they get their footprints audited. And I think those are the types of things to look for. What are the controls? What's the transparency? What are the specific safeguards that are going to deliver on that outcome? I guess another example on the action side is most companies are measuring their footprint in a way where they can't actually see their scope 3 go down because they're using industry average, US EEIO, decade-old emissions factors that don't reflect the choices you may be making on sourcing energy. We're big believers in more granular approaches to scope 3. We've made some acquisitions, have some really cool technology on that front. Those are examples of the type of things that can make a difference on delivering the rigorous outcome, delivering the decarbonization that I think companies are looking for.
Mm-hmm. Let's stick with scope 3 just a moment here. And that does seem to be a place where you are really differentiating, or the Canva deal was all about how a company could address their scope 2 by helping others address their scope 3. What do we really need to see happen? The scope 3 is the thing that people obsess over.
Yes.
What do they need to focus on?
It's a thing people obsess over, and I think the reality is that the space has not made as much progress on this as it should. And so it's really important to get the approach right on scope 3. I think that
what best practices have you seen? I'd love to. Yeah.
I think two things are really important. One is to be walking the spectrum of granularity on measurement as kind of pragmatically and quickly as you can. So what I mean by that is, most companies are stuck in this world of EEIO emissions factors that don't reflect the actions you've taken, that is not a good world to be in terms of trying to actually make progress on scope 3. We think that you can kind of step supplier by supplier or category by category towards more specificity on the impact of your choices that may start with something like a multi-region input-output model. CETA is a database that Watershed has acquired and is developing. It's kind of the leading model on what are the different impacts of what electricity grid you're purchasing from, what region your suppliers are based in, all the way up to collecting product carbon footprints from your suppliers. And so getting on that journey, realizing it's a journey, taking it one step at a time, but ultimately getting to a place where your scope 3 is granular, it reflects your decisions, is part 1. And then I think part 2 is to make action easy for your suppliers. Right now, companies are just sending spreadsheets back and forth to their suppliers, and it is a multi-year journey for the spreadsheet volley to turn into any new solar in the ground, any change in the materials that are used in those products. Instead, we think it makes sense to go to suppliers and say, hey, your big lever is clean power. Let us make it easy for you to deploy clean power. That's what the Canva supply chain PPA is all about, is, hey, here's the easy button on deploying clean power in a high impact way that reduces your scope 2 and our scope 3. And we're doing kind of similar work with customers in the agricultural space and the manufacturing space. What is the specific lever? Make it a lot simpler. This doesn't need to be as complicated as people make it. And then reduce the amount of time and friction it takes to actually deploy that lever in the real world.
Yeah. I have a couple questions here from the audience. One is very specific. Does Watershed provide guidance on how to obtain incentives from government?
Yes, super interesting. And how awesome is it that we now have a policy environment where that is a live thing? Yes, we do. We've got a kind of advisory team that is staying ahead of the curve on all of the different policy. And it's exciting to see companies work some of those incentives into the business case for decarbonization initiatives. Hopefully there's going to be a lot more of that in the future.
Okay, I'm going to try this next question. It's uses a lot of words that I have to figure out, but can Watershed customers leverage statistically robust extrapolation methods for the analysis of samples of data in the case of having a very large universe, such as scope 3 franchise locations? Go.
Yes. Yes. And this is, I think it's one of these really interesting technical problems that is a core part of sustainability data, but really isn't a core part of other, data problems. If you have incomplete data, how do you make rigorous extrapolations that you can stand behind, that you can put in a 10K, even when you don't have every single utility bill or every single invoice from a supplier? Yes, this is something our data science team has invested a lot in. And it's one of those things that I think ultimately CFOs and controllers are now having to pay attention to. What are the anomaly detection approaches? What are the gap filling approaches? If you're missing 3 days of utility data at the end of the month because the utility bill, do you do that gap filling based on the rest of the month? What happened the previous month? Give people kind of control and configurability over that. So yes, there's a whole bunch of kind of unglamorous stuff in that direction that we've invested a lot in.
Got it. How does Watershed navigate nudging customers towards impactful investments that at the end of the day still require a modest price premium, such as a VPPA investment?
Yeah. Well, I think part of our goal is to make that price premium as low as possible. And that's part of the power of aggregating a whole bunch of companies together to kind of have the purchasing power at scale that they wouldn't have on their own. And then fundamentally, we're seeing customers make business cases internally that are really compelling. We're seeing customers calculate what percentage of their revenue comes from customers, their own customers, that have set a science-based target. And if you reason about the uplift in renewal or the reduced risk of one of those customers churning, a lot of investments pay for themselves almost immediately. And so I think the business case for the sustainability action is starting to write itself. And I think that example of kind of revenue at risk from customers who are expecting this of me, these investments start to look very, very small in the scope of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of revenue at risk.
And that's actually another great case about why you want your finance team involved, why you want your sales team involved. Mainly, I know that was Canva's concern. I know that was one of the concerns. Do you have other deals like the Canva deal in the works?
Yes, there's a lot more where that is. There's a lot more coming in that direction. I'm super excited for it. Another thing in that example, by the way, think about the business case of climate action there, shifting from basically having a multi-year engagement with your large customer that comes from a partnership investing in clean power together, not just this year, but for 3 years. That really changes the vendor-customer relationship into a partnership relationship. And that's the type of thing that companies invest a lot of money through other avenues to have. And that when you bring the CFO, you bring the chief revenue officer together, it starts to be a really compelling investment from the business perspective, regardless of what's happening to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere.
You've mentioned some of the compliance, the regulatory landscape that's changing. What about the corporate net zero standard from SBTI and the GHG protocol guidelines? There's a lot of changes coming on the more voluntary side.
Yes.
Specifically the Science Based Targets Initiative's corporate net zero standard. How are you preparing for changes? How are you guiding clients to prepare?
Yeah. Companies are paying a lot of attention to that. Obviously, Trellis has spent a lot of time covering it. And I think it reflects the fact that these two kind of voluntary standard setters have assumed enormous importance in this space, not just for companies, but also for regulations and policy that kind of builds on top of the foundation of the GHG protocol. I think it is really good that the governance of both of those organizations is strong and getting stronger. I think there's a lot in the space that is kind of counting on the rigor of those governance processes. I appreciate that they are trying to approach those processes in a way that doesn't slow down action that companies are taking in the meantime. Ultimately, we just are like spending a lot of time with those organizations, have folks at Watershed that are part of those consultations, sharing what we're learning with customers. And I think the thing that all customers can expect, regardless of exactly how things shake out, is that the rigor bar is going up, especially on the caliber of your scope 3 numbers, especially on the caliber of your reduction plans. And so companies can bank on that. They can bank on the floor getting raised in a way that I think is helpful.
I have 2 more questions for you. What role does Watershed see carbon removal playing in meeting climate goals? Right, you work with Frontier.
Yes.
You referenced Stripe earlier. You've obviously got ties there. How important is that?
I think it's really important. I think we are big believers in decarbonize first, reduce first, mitigation first. We spend a lot of time trying to lower the barriers to mitigation. We've talked about clean power. The thing we haven't talked a lot about is sustainable aviation fuel. Really excited about that as a lever for the business travel emissions that companies used to view as kind of unmitigatable. Supplier engagement is all about mitigation. And then we know that if you think about the world's journey from 50 gigatons to 0 gigatons, there's going to be somewhere between 5 and 10 gigatons of removal that needs to happen. And we are terribly off track for that today. And we're off track for nature-based removal. We're off track for more technological approaches to removal. We are terribly off track. And I think if companies can point their dollars to bring that future forward, that's a huge contribution. It's important to do it right. We think that choosing the right types of projects to support, participating in groups like Frontier that are aggregating purchasing power to mobilize new technologies is a good way to maximize the impact of those dollars. But I think both play a really important role.
Elaborate briefly on the SAF comment on the sustainable aviation fuel.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think in some ways we're all trying to replicate the success of corporate purchasing accelerating clean power innovation and deployment over the last 20 years, where the industry kind of got together, said, hey, let's point our geyser of dollars towards these clean power technologies. Let's come up with kind of innovative market structures that have integrity, enable you to deploy more clean power, even if you're not putting solar directly on your roof. And that had a huge role to play in solar and wind crashing in price, ballooning in scale. And it's I think one of the great success stories in the climate economy thus far. And so, I think there's a lot of efforts to try to bring similar mechanics to bear on these other categories where we need to bring technologies down the cost curve and up the deployment curve. Frontier, carbon removal, we've already talked about. I'm really bullish on the efforts in sustainable aviation fuel, the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance, which is basically trying to broker these agreements between the innovative SAF producers, the airlines that are putting a lot of fuel in their jets every day, but need someone to fund that price premium, and then companies who have a lot of business travel emissions in their footprint, for whom that price premium makes sense in the scheme of their overall climate program, and now are able to sign an agreement that makes sure that SAF gets put in a jet because of their purchase. And anyway, I just think it's a really compelling approach on a piece of the emissions puzzle that a few years ago looked very stubborn, is still a tough, mountain to climb. But there's real impact the second you execute an agreement like that.
All right. Sadly, we're out of time, but one more question for you. What advice do you have for how sustainability professionals can prioritize between now and 2030? Lots to do. Where should they prioritize?
It's a great question. I think, in general, I think prioritization is actually maybe the meta point, which is for most companies, there is a small set of things that move the needle in a big way.
Yeah. And
the key in being effective is not to boil the ocean. It's to figure out, hey, I'm in the agriculture space, deforestation is really important. I'm in the manufacturing space, clean power at my suppliers is really important. Figure out kind of what are those small set of initiatives that will move the needle in a big way. That's piece of advice number one. And then I think piece of advice number two is align yourself to the business. Align yourself to the measurable outcomes that the CFO is going to care about, the CEO is going to care about, Chief Risk Officer is going to care about, the head of sales is going to care about. That's where you get the real investment that ultimately matters.
Taylor, thank you so much for putting yourself under the microscope today. I really appreciate it.
This was great. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you also to the audience for eavesdropping. If you want to eavesdrop on a future interview, join me September 11th. I'll be talking to Caitlin Liebert from Whole Foods Market about a pollinator policy that they introduced late last year to protect bees and other wild pollinators. Thank you so much, everyone.